Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Dwight Eisenhower, and the focus is Supreme Allied Commander, Overlord. The year is 1943. Ike has been promoted. He's now a 4-star general, coming after his victory in North Africa. He also has the win now in Sicily and making progress, a rough slog, but making progress in Italy. But a lot of Ike and his command are focused on the next phase of the war, which was the cross-channel invasion of France. They've been talking about it for over a year and a half now. It seems like finally that is going to take center stage. And one of the questions was, who's going to lead this battle? Would it be Eisenhower or would there be a change? The expectation all along, really ever since Ike came to Europe as the Supreme Commander, that he would not lead the cross-channel fight and the following fights on into Germany, and that would go to General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who was expected to step down, take over that command. Maybe Ike would go back to Washington as Army Chief of Staff, but all of this was in the head of Franklin Roosevelt. The American president had to make this decision. He was actually in North Africa in November of 1943, and he spent a couple of days with Ike, actually getting to know him. They spent 2 full days together. He gave Ike the Legion of Merit as one of his awards, and he told him what he was thinking in terms of the command of Overlord. Ike, you and I know who was Chief of Staff during the last years of the Civil War, but practically no one else knows. I hate to think that 50 years from now, practically nobody will know who George Marshall was. It's one of the reasons why I want George to have the big command. He's entitled to establish his place in history as a great general. This, of course, was disappointing to Eisenhower, but not all that surprising. Roosevelt was actually on his way to a Big Three conference in Tehran, the Big Three being Roosevelt, Winston Churchill of Britain, Joseph Stalin of Russia. Russia had been pushing for this cross-channel invasion really for the last year and a half to try to relieve some of the pressure on the Germans and Russians fighting on the Eastern Front. And the question that Stalin wanted to know is, when is it going to happen and who's going to lead it? The when, they basically agreed, would be in the May-June timeframe of 1944. The who lead, well, Roosevelt wasn't ready to announce a decision because he hadn't made one yet. Finally, as things wrapped up in Tehran, he sat down with George Marshall and said, George, what do you think? Who should lead this thing? Now, Marshall, of course, knew that his name was in the mix. He was his honor and duty said, I'm not going to lobby for this, Mr. President. That is your decision. And so Roosevelt responded, then it will be Eisenhower. I don't think I could sleep at night with you out of the country. Roosevelt then went back to North Africa. He met with Eisenhower, gave him the news. Eisenhower was thrilled at this opportunity and the sense of confidence in him, but he was also exhausted, which General Marshall saw right away. He said, look, before you really get into Overlord, you got to take a break. It's not optional. You're going home 12 days, see your wife, see your family, relax a little bit if you can. Eisenhower didn't really want to go, but he did go under orders and didn't go all that well. When he reunited with Mamie, there were some awkward moments, including, he said, every time I opened my mouth to say something to Mamie, I'd call her Kay. She was furious. Kay, of course, meaning Kay Summersby, his driver, we talked about in the last couple of episodes. Also, they had moved a little bit in different directions. Mamie now more independent, as she had to be over these last couple of years, where Ike was sort of used to everybody following his orders, and that wasn't happening back on the home front. He eventually told Mamie, hell, I'm going back to my theater where I can do what I want. He was frustrated, but mostly he was just anxious to get to work on really the most important part of the war, this cross-channel invasion they called Overlord. When Eisenhower came back, he had his full team in place, this combination of American and British military leaders. Bernard Montgomery, the British general, Monty was going to be leading the ground attack at Normandy, which was going to be the site of the cross-channel invasion. Omar Bradley, the American general, would lead the American forces on the ground. Eisenhower at this point is really the world's foremost authority on leading coalition warfare, and he had learned a lot so far on the job, including the importance of how you deal with people from a personal standpoint, personal relations. He said patience, tolerance, frankness, absolute honesty in all dealings, particularly with persons of the opposite nationality, is absolutely essential in this role as a supreme commander in coalition warfare. Quite a bit of people throughout the war, both before this point and after, criticized the battlefield tactics of Dwight Eisenhower, but he received nearly universal praise even from those critics for his overall lead of this coalition. Now, there were countless debates about the tactics for Operation Overlord. How big a force should they have? How many ships? How many planes? How many paratroopers? Where should they land? The Germans expected the assault to come into France at some point, and they expected it to happen at Calais, which was the shortest distance between Britain and France when you go across the Channel. But as mentioned, the Allies had decided to go a little bit further south, try to catch the Germans off guard and land at Normandy. Both of these sites were very well protected by the Germans, and for flexibility, Hitler had kept 5 Panzer tank divisions in the rear, able to quickly designate where they need to go once the landings actually occurred and the Allies try to breach through the Atlantic Wall. What did the Allies do to prepare for all this? Well, of course, they're training their folks on the side in England, all spread out throughout the island there, but they're also bombing. They've got air superiority throughout much of the area of France, and they're bombing areas, transportation routes, communication routes. They want to make it very difficult for the Germans to rush forces to the beaches when the landings finally occur. There was even some decoys, kind of a fake army was set up by the Allies in Dover in England to throw the British off the tracks, because Dover, again, being directly across from Calais. George Patton, the American general, very well known by looks, he was in the Dover area, still kind of in the doghouse because of the slapping incident that he had in Sicily. He's going to get back in the fight soon, but he would not be involved in the Normandy landings. Right now, he is a decoy. Throughout all of this planning, and really for the last couple of years, the person who seemed to be most against the cross-channel invasion was Winston Churchill. He had real misgivings that this was going to be successful or not. He told Eisenhower, "My dear General, when I contemplate the beaches choked with the flower of British and American youth and the tides running red with their blood, I must say I have my doubts." Well, the final opportunity to weigh in on any of this came when the Allied High Command met on May the 17th of 1944. All the key leaders were present, and Eisenhower and his team went through their attack plans. Everybody was on board. Even Winston Churchill was coming around. He told Eisenhower, "I am hardening toward the Enterprise." They set D-Day for June the 5th. They had a couple of day window, a 3-day window in terms of the optimal situation for the moon and the tide. So June 5th to 7th, that was the window that they were focusing on. Well, the enemy, of course, were the Germans, but the other enemy was the weather. Horrific storms came into this part of Europe in the first week of June. The planes were grounded. The surf was surging. It's 4 a.m. on June the 4th, kind of the last time for Ike to either give the yes or no for the invasion that was due to really commence already. Met back and forth with his team, got differing of opinions, and Eisenhower eventually said, "Look, if the planes can't get off the ground, the surf is too rough, we're going to delay. We'll delay by 1 day." So we called the ships back. Some of them had actually already gotten out into the channel. They were called back, ready to go back 1 more day. The meteorologist for Ike and his command was Group Captain John Stagg, and he's monitoring the weather literally by the minute. He finally says he thinks he sees a break, a window of about 36 hours. He thinks they can land as planned now on June the 6th. It's not great. The weather's not going to be great, but it is an opportunity. So Ike and his team met 4 o'clock in the morning now on June the 5th, seeing whether or not they're going to attack on the 6th. This was not unanimous. There were still differences in the ranks, and ultimately, of course, the decision rests upon one person, Dwight Eisenhower. And his chief of staff, Beadle Smith, said, "I never realized before the loneliness and isolation of a commander at a time when such a momentous decision has to be taken, with the full knowledge that failure or success rests on his judgment alone." Ike sat alone on a couch, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. Are they going to go or not? Eventually, he stood up and said, "Okay, we'll go." And that was the command to launch D-Day. Now, Eisenhower wasn't quite done for the day. He had one more mission he wanted to fulfill. He had spent a lot of time in England meeting with troops. 26 divisions he had met with so far over the last few months at airfields and bases, training camps, facilities. And he wanted to have one more visit, and he went out to see the 101st Airborne. Now, they were one of the last groups to leave. This personal touch was really important to Eisenhower, and it was really important to the men. He would engage, eye contact, meaningful questions, one-on-one, show them he really did care about them as individuals, and he would always flash that famous grin of his, which really mattered as well. According to Admiral Morton Deo, he said it's been said that his smile was worth 20 divisions. That day, it was worth more. Before the warmth of his confidence, the mists of doubt dissolved. When he had finished, the tension was gone. That visit it mattered. They're then flying off, the 101st Airborne, going off into the fight. Ike and Kay Summersby and a few others climbed on top of a roof to watch them go, realizing that many of them would not return. Ike turned to Kay and said, "It's very hard, really, to look a soldier in the eye when you fear you are sending him to his death, but that, of course, is part of the job of command in the military." At this point, though, nothing to do but wait for reports for Eisenhower. He basically spent that evening alone with Kay, anxious, smoking. 132,000 troops ready to storm those beaches, 6,500 ships, including 4,000 landing craft. There were 11,000 planes in action, 20,000 vehicles. This was the largest amphibious assault in the history of mankind. The target were these beaches in Normandy. They split them out over 50 miles into 5 different zones. On the far western side, the Americans had responsibility for Utah and Omaha Beach. The next 3 were for the British and the Canadians, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The Germans provided strong resistance, but the Americans and the British Canadians mostly had success except on Omaha Beach. That's where the fighting was the roughest. The planes for the Allies had missed their targets, most of them. The bombardment from the Navy failed to break through the defenses. The inflatable craft that they had put together for the tanks to bring them onto the shore and provide some cover, well, all but one tank actually sunk. That didn't work. So the men are completely exposed. 800 yards of beach, gunfire coming at them, machine gun fire from the pillboxes of the Germans. There's literally nowhere to hide. The big difference, frankly, for the Allies was mass. They had enough people. Thousands were shot, casualties, people who died on Omaha Beach in particular, but there were enough of these soldiers to make it to the cliffs, to knock out the German defenses and secure that beachhead, all on that first day. There were about 10,000 casualties for the Allies in the fight at D-Day, about 6,000 Americans. Most of those were wounded or killed at Omaha Beach. But by the evening of June the 6th, the Allies were back in Europe. They had a beachhead and they were ready to turn the tide. This was really the final catalyst to the end, Adolf Hitler and his 1,000-year Reich. It wasn't going to be easy because the Germans weren't going to just fall over and let the Americans and the British run over them. They put up a strong fight. Now, they were helped a little bit because Adolf Hitler continued to believe that Normandy was a decoy. He refused to release his panzers until late in the afternoon. By the time he did, he and those panzers met face-to-face with Monty's troops and tanks at Caen. It was Monty's responsibility to break through at Caen, but he couldn't get through. The German defenses were very strong there. While that was happening, the Americans are pivoting to the west, where they're going to go after the port at Cherbourg. This was a much larger port, so they could bring in men and materiel. It was guarded by 40,000 Germans. It took a couple of weeks of fighting before the Americans finally secured. End of June of 1944, Cherbourg was in their hands. It took about a week to get that port up and running. Pretty soon, 1 million troops were on board in Europe for the Allies, 200,000 vehicles. Things were now moving in that direction. Bloody battles every day throughout this period in June and July of 1944. This was not easy. They were fighting, the British and the Americans, against the Germans, fighting basically for every square inch. One of the breakthroughs finally in late July came by the American Third Army. The commander, George Patton. Yep, he's back in the game now. He's in charge of the Third Army, the aggressive general that he is. He helped break through on the path to Brittany around the same time that Monty finally broke through in Caen, and continued to now have that entire beach area in Allied command as they're now moving into the central part of France. Throughout all of this, Ike was actually a little bit depressed. I mean, after all the buildup, there was quite a bit of a letdown. One of the things that helped in was the arrival of his son, John. John had graduated from West Point literally just about the same week as D-Day, and General Marshall had sent him over to spend a couple of weeks with his father. It was actually a good opportunity for both of them, as they were basically inseparable for 2 weeks. He then went back to complete his training before being deployed. Now, Mamie is pretty nervous about this because the life expectancy of a second lieutenant in World War II wasn't very good, but that's something that Ike would worry about in the future. He's got some very strategic decisions to make. Should they take Paris? Should they go around it? Should they go directly into Germany? How are they going to work with the Russians who were coming at things from the east? All of those decisions had to be made. The Supreme Allied Commander would be making them, but those are some stories for another day. That is Dwight Eisenhower and Supreme Allied Commander, Overlord, from the life of Dwight Eisenhower. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.